Prologue. The Moonstone was a large yellow diamond that was famous in the history of India. It was first heard of in the 11th century when the holy city of Somnath, where it was kept, was captured by a Mohammedan general. The Hindu priests who guarded the diamond escaped and took it to Benares, another holy city in India. 3 priests were given the job of watching the diamond day and night. When the priests grew old, they were replaced by other priests. Hundreds of years passed. Then a Mughal emperor attacked the city and took the diamond. The 3 priests could not take it back by force, but they followed the diamond as it passed from one emperor to another. At last, the Sultan of Seringapatam put the diamond in the handle of a dagger and put it in his treasury. The 3 Hindu priests disguised themselves and continued to watch the diamond. Then, in 1799, the British army attacked Seringapatam. The soldiers heard stories about the yellow diamond, but the general of the army said the soldiers were not to take any treasure. However, a greedy officer called Herncastle killed the 3 Indian priests and took the diamond. The last of the priests to die told him that the diamond would bring him bad luck. Chapter 1. Gabriel Betteridge begins the story. My name is Gabriel Betteridge, and I am the house steward for Lady Verinder. Yesterday I was reading my favorite book, Robinson Crusoe, and on page 169 I read, I realized how stupid it was to start a job without knowing whether it was possible to finish it. This morning Mr. Franklin Blake, my lady's nephew, spoke to me. Betteridge, I think the strange story of how the Indian diamond was stolen from my aunt's house 2 years ago should be written down. I agreed with him, of course, but didn't realize that he wanted me to start the story. You can tell the story of how the diamond came to my aunt's house and how it was lost after just 12 hours, he said. I told him that I was not a writer, but he insisted, and I agreed to do it. That was 2 hours ago, and I have been trying to write, but I keep remembering what Robinson Crusoe said about starting something you can't finish. Robinson Crusoe is an amazing book. I am over 70 years old, and I still have a good memory. I've read a few books, but none of them is like Robinson Crusoe. It always helps me to read it. I have worn out 6 copies by reading them. On her last birthday, my lady gave me a 7th. I sat down to read it immediately. I haven't said much about the diamond yet, have I? I'd better start again. The diamond came to my lady's house in Yorkshire when it was given to her daughter as a birthday present. I have known my lady since I became a servant in her father's house when I was 15. She was the youngest of the 3 Herncastle daughters, and she married Sir John Verinder. I have been with her ever since that time. I became the chief groundskeeper with my own house and my own housekeeper. I decided to marry my own housekeeper because that was cheaper than paying her to look after the house. Then I changed my mind, but my housekeeper refused to let me go. We were not happy, but we weren't miserable either. We always got in each other's way. If I was coming up the stairs, she was sure to be coming down, and if I was coming down, she was sure to be coming up. You see how it was. We had a daughter, Penelope, and 5 years later my wife died. Soon after that, Sir John Verinder died too, leaving my lady with a daughter, Miss Rachel. My lady looked after her daughter and looked after mine as well, and at last Penelope became Miss Rachel's personal maid. This made me very happy. Then my lady suggested that I become the house steward. I couldn't decide what to do because I enjoyed the position I had. I started to read Robinson Crusoe. Within 5 minutes I read, "Today we love what tomorrow we hate." I immediately decided to be the house steward, and all because of Robinson Crusoe. Penelope just looked at what I have written and pointed out that I have not said anything about the diamond yet. I've been telling my own story instead. I'd better start again. I'll start with the day that we expected Mr. Franklin Blake to visit the house. Penelope has a diary, so she can tell me the dates. It was Wednesday, the 24th of May, 1848, when my lady told me that Franklin Blake was returning from Europe the next day. He would stay long enough to celebrate Rachel's birthday in June. Rachel was my lady's 17-year-old daughter. I was very pleased to hear of Mr. Franklin Blake's visit because I really liked him. I had not seen him since he was a boy because his father had sent him to Europe for his education. He went to school in Germany and sometimes wrote to us. He borrowed 7 shillings from me before he left, and his letters were usually about borrowing more. When his mother died, he got some money from the will, but it was never enough. The more money he had, the more he wanted. Of course, I never got my 7 shillings back from him. Despite this, he was a friendly and generous man, and by now he was 25 years old. Thursday was a beautiful summer day, and my lady and Miss Rachel went out for lunch. Mr. Franklin Blake was not expected until dinner time. I made sure that his room was ready for him. Then I decided to sit in the sun with a glass of wine and Robinson Crusoe. As I came outside, I heard a soft drum. I went to the front of the house and found 3 Indian men in white clothes looking at the house. One of them asked me if he could show the lady of the house some magic tricks. I told them that the lady of the house was not home and asked them to leave. They left, and I returned to my chair in the sun. I was almost asleep when Penelope ran out of the house and told me that the 3 Indian gentlemen should be arrested. She had heard them talking about Mr. Franklin Blake and wondering whether he had it with him. I didn't think it was very important and wanted to go back to sleep, but Penelope insisted that we find out what it was. I told her that we would have to ask Mr. Franklin Blake when he arrived. Chapter 2. Mr. Franklin Blake arrives in Yorkshire. I had only just sat down again when Nancy, the kitchen maid, came past me looking annoyed. She told me that she had been told to fetch Rosanna, the second housemaid, who had gone to the sands. I told Nancy that I would go and fetch her. However, before I tell that part of the story, I will have to tell you about the sands and about Rosanna because they are both important to the story of the diamond. Rosanna was the only new servant in the house. My lady, visiting London about 4 months before this time, went to a reformatory where young girls went after they had been in jail. She met Rosanna Spearman there. Rosanna was a thief, but the staff told my lady that she deserved another chance. They were sure that she would not steal again if she was in a good house. My lady brought her to Yorkshire. The only people in the house who knew about Rosanna's past were my lady, Rachel, and me. Rosanna seemed thankful for the opportunity to start a new life, and she became a very good servant. However, she would rather read than talk when there was no work to be done, so she didn't make friends with the other servants. She also liked going on lonely walks by herself, while the other servants often walked together. She was not beautiful and had a bad shoulder, but she was very polite and obedient, and I liked her. One of the places where she often walked was the sands. The house was close to the sea, and the sands were part of a small bay. It was only a quarter of a mile away, but it was not a popular walk. The bay was ugly, and the sands were dangerous. Anything thrown onto these sands would quickly sink and would never be seen again. This is where Rosanna liked to come and read. The only other place she sometimes visited was Cobb's Hole, where she had a friend. I'll tell you more about that later. I found her sitting near the sands, looking at the sea and crying. "I am crying about the past," she said, when I asked her why she was sad. "The past has been cleaned away," I replied. "Yes, but it still leaves a mark," she said. She looked at the sands. "Sometimes I think the sands will be my grave," she said. "Come back to the house," I replied, but she would not listen. She continued to look at the sea and talk about the sands until I suddenly heard an unknown voice calling me. Rosanna turned around to see who it was, and I saw her face turn red. "Who is it?" I asked. "Yes, who is it?" she whispered. I turned around to see a young gentleman coming toward us. He ran up and sat beside me. "I owe you 7 shillings, Betteridge," he said. "Do you know who I am?" It was Mr. Franklin Blake. He was 4 hours earlier than we had expected. I saw him look at Rosanna and noticed that her face was even redder than before. She suddenly turned and ran away without speaking to me. "What a strange girl," said Mr. Franklin. I could not explain her behavior, and we soon forgot about her. However, if you read on, you will discover the truth, and perhaps you will feel as sorry for Rosanna Spearman as I did. Mr. Franklin explained that he was early because he noticed that he had been followed in London. When I told him about the 3 Indians who had come to the house, he became very serious. "I think that it means this," he said, taking a small parcel from his pocket. "This is my Uncle Herncastle's famous diamond. My uncle left the diamond to Rachel as a birthday present. My father has asked me to give it to her." This surprised me because I knew that Colonel Herncastle was a bad man. He was my lady's older brother, but he had such a bad name that she would never allow him to enter her house. Everybody knew that he had a valuable diamond, but he would not tell anybody how he got it or even let them see it. He never married and had no friends. About 2 years before the time of our story, he came to the house and asked to see Lady Verinder. It was Rachel's birthday and he wanted to see her. My lady did not want to see him, so I told him that both she and Rachel were too busy. He laughed at that and said that he would remember his niece's birthday. Then he left. A year and a half later, he died. When I told Mr. Franklin this, he was even more worried. "I think that my wicked uncle may be trying to get revenge on his sister by giving this unlucky diamond to Rachel." This made me so worried that I longed to smoke my pipe and read a few pages of Robinson Crusoe. "Many years ago," continued Mr. Franklin, "my father wanted some family papers from my Uncle Herncastle. My uncle would not give them to him unless he agreed to help him with the diamond. He said that the diamond would be kept in a bank, and that my father was to receive a letter from him each year to prove that he was still alive. If the letter did not arrive, it would mean that he had been murdered. My father was then to send the diamond to Amsterdam immediately and have it cut up into separate diamonds. My father agreed, and never saw his brother again, although he received a letter from him every year. 8 months ago, he received a different letter, asking him to come and help him make his will because he was dying. In this will, my uncle left the diamond to Rachel, but only if her mother was still alive. The will also said that this was proof that he had forgiven her, but I don't trust him. He knew that the diamond was unlucky, and he also knew that the Indians wanted it back. That's why he gave it to Rachel. The will also said that Lady Verinder had to read the will so that she would know he had forgiven her. I began to understand why Mr. Franklin was worried. Chapter 3. Rosanna Spearman Falls in Love. Mr. Franklin told me that when he took the diamond out of the bank to bring it with him to Yorkshire and give it to Rachel, he was followed by an Indian man. He eventually got away from him and caught an earlier train. Then Penelope told me about 3 Indian jugglers talking about me and wondering if I had it with me. Could this be coincidence? It makes me so worried that I think I should throw it into the sands so that it can do no harm. But of course I can't do that. It is Rachel's. "If you are not going to throw the diamond into the sands, Mr. Franklin," I said, "I think the safest thing to do is to take it to the bank in Frizinghall, our nearest town, before the Indians know you have arrived. Leave it there until Miss Rachel's birthday." Mr. Franklin thought this was an excellent idea. We prepared the fastest horse in the stable, and soon he was galloping to Frizinghall with the diamond. Back at the house, Penelope wanted to know what Mr. Franklin had said. I didn't tell her. When the ladies returned, they wanted to know why he had arrived so early and why he had gone away again. I didn't tell them anything. Then Penelope told me that Rosanna had behaved strangely when she returned from the sands. One moment she was happy, and the next she was sad, and the next she was angry. Rosanna had asked many questions about Mr. Franklin Blake. "I'm sure that she has fallen in love with him," said Penelope. I laughed so hard that tears came to my eyes. Penelope told me that I was cruel and left the room. I felt bad, but whoever heard of a servant girl falling in love with a gentleman at first sight? Evening came, and Mr. Franklin returned from Frizinghall. He had put the diamond safely in the bank and had not seen the Indians at all. At dinner that night, it was clear that Miss Rachel and Mr. Franklin found each other very attractive and enjoyed each other's company. When I locked up the house that night, I thought I saw shadows of people in the garden, and then I heard footsteps running away. It was too dark to see properly, but I thought they might have been Indians. The Indians did not bother us again during the weeks before Miss Rachel's birthday. Perhaps they had heard that Mr. Franklin had been at the bank. They stayed in Frizinghall but did not come near us. 4 or 5 days later, Miss Rachel and Mr. Franklin found a new way to pass the time. He had discovered a new mixture for paints, and Miss Rachel wanted to try it. They decided to paint the door of her living room in a decorative style. It seemed to be slow work, but neither of them was ever tired of it. When they were not riding, or having visitors, or eating, or singing, they were painting that door. By the beginning of June, Mr. Franklin seemed very much in love, but it was not so clear what Miss Rachel thought. She was just 17 years old, small, slim, and pretty. She had black hair and dark eyes, and her skin was warm and beautiful. However, she was different from other girls her age because she had ideas of her own. She never asked for advice and never told you what she was going to do. She just did it. I must add, though, that she was never dishonest. She never said yes when she meant no. On the 12th of June, my lady sent an invitation to the birthday party to another cousin, Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite. He was the son of my lady's other sister, whose marriage was not a happy one. It was my opinion that Miss Rachel would marry him rather than Mr. Franklin. He was a tall man with blonde hair and spent all his time raising money for charities, usually to help poor women. He was an excellent public speaker and seemed to love everybody. Therefore, everybody loved him. Mr. Franklin did what he could. He stopped smoking cigars because Miss Rachel said she didn't like the smell. As a result, he didn't sleep well, but he was determined to please Miss Rachel. On the 16th of June, a gentleman came to see Mr. Franklin. After the visit, Mr. Franklin spoke to my lady and Miss Rachel, who said some sharp things to him. The next day was the first that they did not paint together. On the 17th, they were happy again and painted together. Penelope said that Mr. Franklin had proposed, but Miss Rachel had not given an answer. However, I didn't think that this would be true. On the 19th, we had the doctor in the house to see Rosanna Spearman. I couldn't believe that this poor girl was in love with Mr. Franklin, but her behavior was strange. She was always where Mr. Franklin was. Her appetite was bad, and she cried at night. One night, Penelope saw her in Mr. Franklin's room. She took a rose that Miss Rachel had given him and replaced it with her own. My lady noticed her behavior and offered to send her to one of her farms, but Rosanna begged to stay. I advised my lady to let her stay, but if I could have seen the future, I would have sent her far, far away. On the 20th, a note came from Mr. Godfrey saying that he would arrive the next day. With the note came an expensive gift for Miss Rachel. Mr. Franklin had given her a gift only half as valuable. Chapter 4. Mr. Murthwaite Gives Some Advice. The 21st of June was Miss Rachel's birthday. After breakfast, I spoke to Mr. Franklin about the diamond. It was time to get it back from the bank at Frizinghall and give it to Miss Rachel. He was very nervous about it, but decided to go after lunch, collect the diamond, and return with Mr. Godfrey and his 2 sisters, who were also coming for the birthday. Mr. Franklin and Miss Rachel spent the morning painting the door. They didn't stop until 3 o'clock, but they were happy because at last the decoration was finished. Mr. Franklin rode to Frizinghall and returned with his 3 cousins. Mr. Godfrey seemed unhappy, but his sisters were very cheerful. Mr. Franklin told me that he had the diamond in his pocket and that he had not seen the Indians at all. A little while later, I heard the ladies exclaiming over the beauty of the diamond in the drawing room. I went in and saw Miss Rachel holding the diamond. Mr. Godfrey's 2 sisters knelt beside her, looking at it. Mr. Godfrey himself also looked at it and said how wonderful it was. My lady stood by the window, reading her brother's will. She told me to come to her room, where she told me that she did not trust her brother, and she wanted to get the diamond away from her daughter as soon as possible. As I was preparing for dinner, Penelope told me that Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite had proposed to Miss Rachel, but she had refused him. She had heard them speaking in the garden. The guests began to arrive for the birthday dinner that evening. 2 of them are important for our story. Dr. Candy, our doctor from Frizinghall, sat on one side of Miss Rachel, and Mr. Murthwaite, a traveler who had been to India, sat near her too. He warned her never to take the diamond to India, because jewels were sometimes part of the Hindu religion and might put her in danger. This seemed to make the diamond even more interesting to Miss Rachel. The conversation at dinner did not go well, and ended in an argument between Mr. Franklin and Dr. Candy. Mr. Franklin was still not sleeping well, and Dr. Candy suggested that he take some medicine. Mr. Franklin said he didn't need any medicine and that doctors couldn't help him. They argued about it until my lady had to stop them. I was preparing the wine after dinner when I heard the soft drum of the 3 Indian jugglers, and a moment later they appeared on the terrace. I wanted them to leave, but the ladies had heard them and wanted to see their tricks. Miss Rachel came to see them too, wearing the diamond on her dress. When they had performed a few tricks, Mr. Murthwaite spoke to them quietly in their own language. They looked very surprised and frightened and told the ladies that the tricks were finished. They bowed and laughed. I followed them to the gate to make sure they had gone. On returning, I met Mr. Franklin and Mr. Murthwaite talking in the garden. Mr. Murthwaite told us that the Indians were not real jugglers at all. When Mr. Franklin told him the story of the Moonstone and how it came to be on Miss Rachel's dress, Mr. Murthwaite told him he was lucky to be alive. They would kill 1,000 people to recover the diamond, he said. They saw the diamond on Miss Rachel's dress, said Mr. Franklin. What shall we do? Send the diamond tomorrow to Amsterdam to be cut up. That will solve the problem, said Mr. Murthwaite. Let the dogs loose tonight to stop the Indians from returning. Mr. Franklin agreed, and the 2 gentlemen went into the house. I was very worried, so I went to my room and opened Robinson Crusoe. This is what I found on page 161. Fear of danger is more frightening than danger itself. What an amazing book! Meanwhile, the party continued. Mr. Godfrey's 2 sisters sang. My lady played cards but played badly. Mr. Murthwaite fell asleep in a corner. Mr. Godfrey and Mr. Franklin argued about ladies' charities. Dr. Candy left the room for a while, and when he returned, he spoke to Mr. Godfrey. I took the dogs with me and searched the garden, but we found nothing. It began to rain as the guests were leaving. Everybody had closed carriages except Dr. Candy, who rode home in the rain, telling me that his skin was waterproof and laughing at his own joke. Soon, only Mr. Franklin Blake and Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite were left. Mr. Godfrey's sisters had gone home to Frizinghall, but Mr. Godfrey stayed. Rachel, where are you going to put your diamond tonight? Asked my lady. It's an Indian diamond, so it should go into the Indian cabinet, laughed Miss Rachel. But it has no lock, said my lady. Is this a hotel? Replied Miss Rachel. Are there thieves in the house? My lady offered to look after it herself, but Miss Rachel refused, and my lady went to bed. Come and see me tomorrow morning, Rachel, she said as she went. I have something to say to you. Mr. Franklin was sitting quietly in a corner, looking very tired. I saw Miss Rachel say good night to him in a way that made me think that perhaps she did like him better than Mr. Godfrey. When Mr. Franklin went to bed, Mr. Godfrey insisted that he have a drink to help him sleep. Before going to bed myself, I let the dogs loose, although it was still raining, and I made sure all the doors and windows in the house were locked. The following morning it was bright and sunny, and I went downstairs to tie up the dogs. It was about 8 o'clock. Penelope ran down the stairs after me. Father, come upstairs. The diamond is gone. Are you mad? It's gone. Come up and see. Chapter 5. Superintendent Seagrave Investigates. I went to the little living room and found Miss Rachel standing in front of the Indian cabinet, staring at an empty drawer. I saw her put it in there, said Penelope. The diamond is gone, said Miss Rachel in a strange voice. Then she went into her bedroom and locked the door. My lady came into the living room, heard about the diamond, and went to Miss Rachel's bedroom. Miss Rachel let her in. Although Mr. Godfrey came in and said it was terrible, Mr. Franklin had slept well for once and took control. He told the servants to not touch the doors and windows and made sure that the diamond hadn't fallen behind the cabinet or the table on which it stood. It was not there. Then he wanted to speak to Miss Rachel, but my lady came out of her daughter's bedroom and said that Miss Rachel would not talk to anybody. We will have to call the police, said my lady. "Yes," agreed Mr. Franklin, "and the first thing they must do is arrest the 3 Indian jugglers." My lady and Mr. Godfrey were both surprised, not knowing what Mr. Franklin and I did about the Indians. Mr. Godfrey said that one of the jugglers must have hidden in the house before I locked it up, heard where the diamond was to be kept, and simply took it. However, I couldn't understand how they escaped from the house when everything was locked and the dogs were loose. Mr. Franklin took a horse and rode to Frizinghall to get the police while we had breakfast. My lady told me that Miss Rachel was behaving very strangely and would not talk to her about what had happened. Mr. Godfrey walked around in the house, not knowing what to do. All the servants except Rosanna Spearman, who kept to herself, stood in groups and whispered to each other. Mr. Franklin returned at 11 o'clock. "Superintendent Seagrave and 2 men are coming," he said, "but the case is hopeless. The Indians are innocent. They were seen in Frizinghall several times during the night and could not have been here to steal the diamond. They have been locked up, but there is no case against them." Superintendent Seagrave and his men arrived 10 minutes later. He examined the house, but found no evidence that anybody had broken into it during the night. The female servants wanted to go to their rooms and went to see him in the little living room. He stopped them from doing so and told them to go back to work. He pointed at a smear on the newly painted door. Rosanna Spearman saw the smear and left the room, followed by the others. Superintendent Seagrave began to question everyone. He started with Penelope and then asked for Miss Rachel, who sent a written reply saying that she had nothing to say and would not speak to anyone. Then he questioned Mr. Godfrey and Mr. Franklin, who hadn't heard or seen anything during the night. Superintendent Seagrave returned to the living room with his 2 men. Penelope and I followed them and watched them search the room again. Suddenly, Miss Rachel came out of her bedroom. She walked out on the terrace and spoke angrily to Mr. Franklin, who looked surprised. After my lady went on to the terrace, Miss Rachel spoke again to Mr. Franklin and then went back into the house. Mr. Franklin and my lady spoke for a moment and then spoke to Mr. Godfrey, who was also on the terrace. Miss Rachel burst into the living room, her cheeks burning and her eyes blazing. Superintendent Seagrave tried to speak to her, but she shouted at him, "I have not sent for you. I don't want you. My diamond is lost, and neither you nor anybody else will ever find it." She went into her bedroom and locked the door again, and we heard her cry. Nobody knew what it meant. Mr. Franklin would not repeat what Miss Rachel had said to him, and even my lady could not understand her daughter. Superintendent Seagrave asked me about the characters of our servants. Of course, I immediately thought of Rosanna Spearman, but I did not tell him about her past. "All our servants are trustworthy," I told him. He examined them one by one, but none of them could tell him anything important. He seemed to believe that because Penelope was the last person to see the diamond, she was the thief. Penelope was very upset. I was angry too, because I knew that the superintendent was wrong. Then he interviewed my lady. He told her that one of the servants must have taken the diamond and asked permission for his men to search the rooms. "I will not allow you to treat my trusted servants as thieves," she replied. I gave him the keys to my room. "We thank my lady for her trust," I said, "but we must do the right thing." The other servants followed my example, and all the rooms were searched. The diamond was not found. I received a message from Mr. Franklin to see him in the library. I was very surprised to see Rosanna Spearman walk out of the library as I walked in, because the servants were not allowed into that room after it had been cleaned early in the morning. "Why were you in the library?" I asked her. "Mr. Franklin Blake had dropped a ring upstairs, and I wanted to give it to him," she answered. I entered the library, and Mr. Franklin told me he wanted to go to the railway station to send a message to London. "We need a better police officer than Superintendent Seagrave," he said. "By the way, Rosanna Spearman is acting very strangely. She brought me a ring I had dropped and then spoke to me. She said, 'They will never find the diamond, sir, will they? Nor the person who took it, I'm sure.' She smiled at me, but then she heard you coming and she left. I think she is mad." Chapter 6. Sergeant Cuff Investigates. I tried to explain Rosanna Spearman's strange behavior as well as I could. "Women are very strange," I said. Mr. Franklin seemed satisfied with that and told me to get a horse for him. He wanted to go to Frizinghall to send a telegram to his father about the police officer. Penelope told me that Rosanna was sick and had gone to her room to lie down. She still believed that Rosanna was in love with Mr. Franklin. This might explain her strange behavior. I brought the horse to the front door for Mr. Franklin and found that Superintendent Seagrave and Mr. Godfrey were planning to go to Frizinghall, and Mr. Franklin would go with them. Superintendent Seagrave had decided that somebody in the house had stolen the diamond for the Indians, and he wanted to interview them again. Mr. Godfrey thought it would be interesting to see it. Mr. Franklin asked me to watch Rosanna Spearman carefully while he was away, and told me that he was very worried about Miss Rachel. Then they all rode off to Frizinghall. Nothing important happened that afternoon. Rosanna stayed in her room until tea time, when she behaved so strangely that my lady sent her back to bed. Miss Rachel also stayed in her room and said she did not want tea. Mr. Franklin and Mr. Godfrey returned. Mr. Murthwaite had helped them examine the Indians, who were still locked up, but they had not found any evidence to link them with the servants. Two things happened before breakfast the next morning. The baker's man said he had seen Rosanna Spearman walking to Frizinghall by a footpath over the moor the previous afternoon. He was wrong, because we all knew that Rosanna had spent the afternoon sick in her room. Then the postman brought a letter from Dr. Candy telling us that he had become ill after his drive in the rain. After breakfast, Mr. Franklin received a message from his father saying that Sergeant Cuff, a famous detective, was coming on the morning train to investigate the case. When Superintendent Seagrave heard that Sergeant Cuff was coming, he locked himself in a room to write a report. Sergeant Cuff was a tall, thin man with a soft voice. At first, he seemed more interested in our rose garden than in the missing diamond. He told me that he would retire soon and grow roses. He had some definite ideas about rose gardens and gave our gardener some advice. Then he locked himself up with Superintendent Seagrave for a while before going to the little living room. He looked all around it and noticed the mark on the painted door that Superintendent Seagrave had already seen. "How did this happen?" he asked. "The women did it with their dresses when they all came in to see me," said Superintendent Seagrave. "Which one?" "I don't know, it's not important." "Everything is important," replied Sergeant Cuff. "We must know which dress did it. We must also know if the paint was still wet when the women came to see you. What time was it?" 11 o'clock. Sergeant Cuff soon found out from Mr. Franklin that the paint dried in 12 hours and that the door had been finished at 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. It was dry at 3 o'clock on Thursday morning, Superintendent Seagrave, which is 8 hours before the women came to see you. "You may have given us the clue to the mystery," Sergeant Cuff said to Mr. Franklin. Suddenly, the door of Miss Rachel's bedroom opened. "Did you say that he had given you the clue?" she asked Sergeant Cuff. "He may have." She looked at Mr. Franklin strangely. Then she said to Sergeant Cuff, "Do your job, but do not let him help you." "Do you know anything about the smear?" he asked her. "No." That was all she said. She went back into the bedroom. Mr. Franklin was very upset, but he tried to answer Sergeant Cuff's questions. He said that he had not really looked at the painted door after it was finished. Penelope, however, could say that she had seen the door at midnight, when she helped Miss Rachel put the diamond away in the Indian cabinet. The smear was not there then, she said. Sergeant Cuff asked her to show him the dress she was wearing then. There was no paint on it. "Somebody came into the room between 12 and 3 o'clock, and there will be paint on his or her clothes," said the sergeant. "We must find that item of clothing, whose it is, and why the paint is on it. If we can find that, we will soon find the diamond." He told Superintendent Seagrave that he was useless and should go back to Frizinghall. Then he asked me to see if Lady Verinder had a few moments to talk to him. As I left the room, I heard him tell Mr. Franklin that nobody had stolen the diamond. We were very surprised, but he would not explain what he meant. My lady did not wish to see Sergeant Cuff, but agreed to do so if I stayed with her. He wanted to examine all the clothes of all the people who were in the house on the night that the diamond was lost. My lady agreed that she would be the first. She felt sure that her daughter and 2 nephews would also agree and that the servants would follow. Mr. Godfrey was about to leave, but agreed that his luggage could follow him later and gave Sergeant Cuff his keys. Mr. Franklin also agreed. While we waited for Miss Rachel's keys, Sergeant Cuff asked to see the laundry book. Rosanna brought it in. He examined the book, and Rosanna took it away. "The last time I saw your housemaid," he said, "she was in jail for theft." Chapter 7. Rosanna Spearman Goes to Cobb's Hole. When Sergeant Cuff recognized Rosanna Spearman as a former thief, we had to explain her presence in the house, and asked if he suspected her of taking the diamond. "I suspect nobody at present," he replied. Then we received a message from Miss Rachel, saying that she would not allow her wardrobe to be searched. Sergeant Cuff did not seem very disappointed. He decided that nobody's wardrobe would be examined, and that Mr. Godfrey's clothes could be sent to London immediately. "Let's go and look at the roses," he said. We walked along the path to the garden. "I must ask you about Rosanna Spearman," he said. "I saw her hiding in the bushes just now. That is easily explained if she has a sweetheart. If she does not, it looks very suspicious." What could I say? I told him the truth. Rosanna Spearman has been foolish enough to fall in love with Mr. Franklin Blake. He laughed but promised to keep her secret. We went back to the house, and Sergeant Cuff used my room to interview the servants one by one. Afterward, he said that if Rosanna Spearman asked to go out to let her go, but to tell him about it first. A moment later, Rosanna did ask to go out. Sergeant Cuff told me to lock the door of my room and tell everybody that he was inside. Then he set out to follow Rosanna. I had a cup of tea with the other women servants and soon found out what they had told Sergeant Cuff. They knew that Rosanna had not been in her room when she was pretending to be ill. They had also listened at her door and heard her working late at night, as well as the crackle of a fire at 4 o'clock in the morning. I went back to the garden and met Mr. Franklin, who had returned from bringing his cousin to the station. My lady told him that Miss Rachel refused to have her wardrobe searched, and he was quite upset. "I wish we had thrown that diamond into the sands," he said. He asked about Sergeant Cuff, and I told him that he was following Rosanna Spearman. I also told him what I had learned from the women servants. "Didn't the baker's man say he saw her walking to Frizinghall that afternoon?" he asked. "If the paint-stained dress is hers, then that is what she was burning. I'll go and tell my aunt immediately." "Please don't," said a voice behind us. It was Sergeant Cuff. "Why not?" "Because she will tell Miss Rachel. If you tell her, I will give up the case and return to London." Mr. Franklin was angry, but had to agree, and walked away. Sergeant Cuff asked me to show him the path to the sands. I led the way there. "Rosanna Spearman is not in danger," said Sergeant Cuff, "because she is acting for another person. I will tell you what happened. On Thursday morning, Superintendent Seagrave pointed out the smear on the door. Rosanna went to her room and found the paint on her dress. In the afternoon, she secretly went to Frizinghall to purchase material for a new one, and on Thursday night, she made it. She did not burn the old one because she did not want the smell of burning to give away her secret." I listened carefully. Could all this be true? "She is now trying to hide the paint-stained dress," continued the sergeant. "I followed her to a small village where she went into a cottage. She was hiding something under her clothes when she came out. She came north along the coast toward this place, but I could not follow her because there was nowhere to hide from her. We arrived at the sands, but there was nobody there. Sergeant Cuff began to search for footprints and soon found some. Look, she has gone down to the water here and then returned. I think she walked in the water to hide her footprints. She has hidden something at one end of the beach or the other. Let's go to the cottage. We may find out what she hid." We walked to Cobb's Hole, where the cottage was. It belonged to the Yollans, a respectable family of fishermen. I knew that Rosanna was friends with their daughter Lucy, who limped because of a bad foot. She was Rosanna's only friend, but was not home when we arrived. Sergeant Cuff soon found out from Mrs. Yolland that Rosanna had bought a tin box and a chain from her. Sergeant Cuff thanked Mrs. Yolland. "I'm sure that Rosanna Spearman has put something in the tin box and tied it to the chain and then hidden it somewhere in the water or the sands. The end of the chain will be tied under a rock somewhere that only she knows. But what did she put in the box?" I suggested it might be the diamond, but he thought it might be the stained dress or nightgown, although he couldn't understand why she hadn't just destroyed it. Back at the house, we found that Rosanna had returned an hour ago and was having supper with the other servants. My lady told us that Miss Rachel had decided to stay with her aunt in Frizinghall and would leave the next day. "I thought this would happen," said Sergeant Cuff. "Please delay her departure until the afternoon." As soon as we were alone, I confronted Sergeant Cuff. "Why did you think Miss Rachel would leave?" "I am sure that Miss Verinder has stolen her own diamond and is working with Rosanna Spearman," he said. I was so surprised and angry that I almost hit him and demanded to know his reasons. "I will have to tell Lady Verinder tomorrow, and you will hear it then too," he replied. I walked on the terrace, feeling very old and miserable. Even my pipe and Robinson Crusoe could not help me. Chapter 8. Rosanna Spearman Goes to the Sands. Was the sergeant right? Had Miss Rachel stolen her own diamond? I could not believe it. Why would she do it? Sergeant Cuff sent a message to Frizinghall saying that he would like to speak to Mr. Murthwaite the next day, and then went to speak to the gardener about his roses. Penelope told me that Miss Rachel had been very angry when her mother told her she could not leave until the afternoon on the next day. Then Rosanna Spearman rushed past me looking very upset, and soon Mr. Franklin came past me too. I was playing billiards, he told me, when suddenly Rosanna Spearman stood beside me. She said she wanted to speak to me. It was very awkward. I asked what she wanted, but continued to play billiards. That made it worse. Suddenly she said, "He looks at the balls instead of me." Then she turned and ran from the room. He thought she was about to confess that she had stolen the diamond, and I hoped he was right. I wished that the diamond had never come to our house. Everybody was upset. My lady was worried, Miss Rachel was angry, Penelope was upset, Rosanna Spearman was crying in her bedroom, and Mr. Franklin was worried about Miss Rachel as well as Rosanna. Then, when I went to bed, I found Sergeant Cuff trying to sleep in the passage outside Miss Rachel's living room. He explained that he didn't want Miss Rachel and Rosanna Spearman to have the chance to talk together during the night. Nothing happened during the night. The next morning, I was walking with Mr. Franklin in the garden when Sergeant Cuff joined us. He asked Mr. Franklin what he knew about Rosanna Spearman, but Mr. Franklin would not answer his questions. We saw Rosanna and Penelope further along the path, but Sergeant Cuff and Mr. Franklin pretended not to notice them. "You should answer my questions," said Sergeant Cuff loudly, "if you have any interest in Rosanna Spearman." Mr. Franklin was annoyed with this suggestion, so he answered just as loudly, "I take no interest in Rosanna Spearman." I saw Rosanna turn and leave the garden, and Penelope followed her. After breakfast, Sergeant Cuff went to Frizinghall to see Mr. Murthwaite, and I, for one, was pleased to see him go. Penelope told me that Rosanna was very upset about what Mr. Franklin had said. She is doing her work like a machine. She seems to be looking at something that nobody else can see. I found Rosanna sweeping the hall. I tried to speak to her, but she spoke like somebody in a dream. I thought we should call the doctor, but remembered that Dr. Candy was ill. His assistant, Mr. Ezra Jennings, was a strange man, and I didn't trust him. Sergeant Cuff returned from Frizinghall. He told me that the Indians could not have stolen the diamond. "However, if we do not find it, they will," he added. He had been to the shop and discovered that Rosanna had bought enough cloth to make a nightgown. She must have got paint on her nightgown when she was stealing the Moonstone that night. She has hidden that nightgown and made a new one. We must find the box at the end of the chain. However, it was now time for Miss Rachel to leave. The carriage came for her. Sergeant Cuff said, "Your departure is a big obstacle in the search for the diamond." "Go on, driver," was her only answer. Mr. Franklin ran out of the house, calling out, "Goodbye, Rachel," but she did not even wave at him, and the carriage drove away. He had tears in his eyes when he told me that he had spoken to Lady Verinder and wanted to leave. Sergeant Cuff took me by the arm. "Miss Verinder has the diamond in the carriage with her," he said. "I wonder where Rosanna Spearman is." Nobody had seen her for over an hour. The last servant to have seen her was Nancy, the kitchen maid. She saw Rosanna give the butcher a letter and ask him to post it in Frizinghall. "That's a long way round to get a letter to Cobb's Hole," she heard the butcher say. "That letter will tell us where the hiding place is," said Sergeant Cuff. "One of the boys in the stable told us that he had seen Rosanna running toward the sands only half an hour ago. It was raining hard when Sergeant Cuff, the boy, and I reached the sands. However, we managed to find her footprints leading toward the sea. We could find no footprints coming away from it. Suddenly, we realized what had happened. 'There's been a terrible accident,' said Sergeant Cuff. 'No, she has killed herself,' I said. I was right. At the house, Penelope had found a letter in Rosanna's room, addressed to me. In it, she thanked me and said goodbye. My lady was furious when she heard what had happened and blamed Sergeant Cuff. She wanted him to leave immediately, but he told her that it was not his fault and asked for a little more time. He found out from Penelope that Rachel loved Mr. Franklin, although Mr. Franklin did not know it. Mr. Franklin, meanwhile, was even more determined to leave the house. "I cannot stay here while Miss Rachel is angry with me, and she will be angry with me forever," he said. My lady sent a message asking Sergeant Cuff and me to come and see her. We left Mr. Franklin looking very sad in the passage. Chapter 9. Sergeant Cuff presents his case. Sergeant Cuff and I went into my lady's living room. "Do you believe that my daughter has taken the diamond and is hiding it?" "I do," replied the sergeant. She looked at him steadily. "Let me tell you that you are wrong. She will not tell me anything, but I know my daughter. She is not capable of it. Now tell me your reasons." Sergeant Cuff explained that he had often seen cases of young ladies like Miss Rachel who had got into debt buying clothes and jewels. He outlined the case against her. Miss Verinder would not allow Superintendent Seagrave to interview her. When I first saw her, she came out of her room and was still very upset, more than a day after the diamond had been lost. She was very rude to me and very angry with Mr. Franklin Blake. I could understand that she was upset. It was a very valuable diamond. But why was she angry with everyone who tried to help her recover it? I am sure she has a debt that she cannot tell you about and needs the diamond to pay it back. "You are wrong, because you cannot be right," said my lady. "I tested my theory," continued Sergeant Cuff. "I suggested examining everybody's wardrobe. Everybody agreed except Miss Verinder. Then, as she was leaving the house today, I told her that her departure was an obstacle to recovering the diamond. She left. She refused to say goodbye to Mr. Franklin Blake, although he had done more than anybody to help recover the lost jewel. What does all this mean if she does not have the diamond?" My lady looked at him in silence. I looked at him and wished that he was on an island in the middle of the sea, like Robinson Crusoe. Sergeant Cuff continued. "You will remember that I recognized Rosanna Spearman when she came in with the laundry book. I immediately thought that she could be Miss Verinder's accomplice. My reason was that Rosanna Spearman was the best person to help Miss Verinder raise money from a loan on the diamond. She knew people in London who would lend money on stolen items without asking too many questions." He talked about Rosanna's strange behavior and showed how it made her guilty of helping Miss Rachel. Then he suggested that Miss Rachel be watched day and night by secret police officers, but my lady instantly refused permission for such a terrible plan. "I have another plan," continued the sergeant. "I think she will be very upset when she hears that Rosanna Spearman is dead. In her shock and grief, she may say something that reveals the truth. I would like to go to Frizinghall and give her the news without warning to see what she says. Does my lady agree?" "Yes, I do, with one small change. You will stay here, and I will go to Frizinghall. You can be sure that I will test her as well as you could. I will tell you the result tonight. When Mr. Franklin heard about my lady's plan, he decided to delay his departure until after the result was known. What shall I do? He asked me. All my plans included Miss Rachel. I suggested reading Robinson Crusoe, but he shut the book without reading a word. We could hear Sergeant Cuff and the gardener discussing roses in the garden. Then a messenger came from Frizinghall, telling us that my lady had decided to stay with her sister there. He had a letter for Mr. Franklin and another for me. My letter asked me to tell Sergeant Cuff that she had spoken to her daughter with the following results. Miss Rachel denied that she had ever spoken privately to Rosanna Spearman from the day of her arrival in the house. She also denied owing any money to anybody, nor, since the day of its loss, had the diamond been in her possession. She said that one day her mother would know the reason for her silence, and she would not then or ever have reason to be ashamed of her daughter. Sergeant Cuff listened but was not convinced. I will leave now, he said, but I am sure that I will have to return. The matter is not closed. I asked him to explain what he meant. 3 things will happen in the future, he said. First, you will hear from the Yollands when the postman delivers Rosanna Spearman's letter to them on Monday. It was like throwing a bucket of cold water over me. I had forgotten about the Yollands and the strange things that Rosanna had done. Second, he continued, you will hear of the 3 Indians again. Third, you will hear something about the moneylender in London. He wrote the moneylender's name in my pocketbook, Mr. Septimus Luker. With that, he set out for the railway station and was gone. Mr. Franklin was also ready to go. He showed me the letter that my lady had sent him. It said much the same as my letter and finished by advising Mr. Franklin to be patient and not come near Miss Rachel for a while. The loss of the diamond does not seem to be a mystery to her, but she will not talk to me about it, she wrote. I think it will be best if we try to forget the diamond for a while. Where will you go? I asked him. I don't know and I don't care, he replied bitterly. Saturday evening was sad and lonely after he had gone. I smoked my pipe and read Robinson Crusoe. On Sunday, my lady sent the carriage home with news that she and Miss Rachel would go to London on Monday. I was quite worried about Mr. Franklin. I decided to write Mr. Jeffco, his father's butler, asking him to tell me where Mr. Franklin went. On Monday, after I sent the servants, including Penelope, to London, Lucy Yolland came to the house. The first of Sergeant Cuff's predictions had come true. Where is Franklin Blake? She demanded angrily. He is a murderer. He has killed Rosanna Spearman. She was my best friend, and I loved her. She began to cry. We were planning to go to London and make a living there, but she loved Franklin Blake, and now she is dead. She held a letter in her hand. It was from Rosanna, addressed to Mr. Franklin Blake. She would not give it to me. I must give it to him myself. If he has gone away, he must come back and get it from me. On Tuesday, I received a letter from Penelope in London and another from Mr. Jeffco, telling me that Mr. Franklin had left England already, after quarreling with his father. The contents of Rosanna's letter would have to remain a mystery. On Thursday, I had another letter from Penelope telling me that a doctor had advised that parties and plays would make Miss Rachel happier and help her forget the loss of the Moonstone. Mr. Godfrey had been to see her too. On Saturday, I received a newspaper article sent to me by Sergeant Cuff. It said that a certain Mr. Luker had complained to the police that 3 Indian gentlemen were creating trouble outside his office. His other predictions had come true. Miss Rachel was in London, there were the 3 Indians, and there was Mr. Luker. If Sergeant Cuff was correct, this could only mean that Miss Rachel had taken the diamond to Mr. Luker and the Indians had followed it there. But was he correct? My part of the story has come to an end. Next, you will hear from Miss Clack, a poor relation of the family. Do not believe anything that she says about me. Chapter 10. Miss Drusilla Clack tells her story. My parents, who are now both in heaven, taught me to be neat and tidy. They also taught me to keep a diary. Because of my diary, I am able to help Mr. Franklin Blake, a wealthy member of my uncle's family. He has offered to pay me to write about what I saw at my Aunt Verinder's house in London. At first, pride would not let me accept the check, but finally Christian humility won, and I took the money in a spirit of self-denial. Here is that story. On Monday, July 3, 1848, I decided to visit Aunt Verinder's house after seeing that it was occupied. The maid who opened the door was the daughter of that terrible old man called Bettridge. She left me waiting and returned to say that Lady Verinder invited me to lunch the next day. I offered the girl a leaflet. She would not take it, but when I left, I put it in the letterbox. I put another under the door. This made me feel a lot better. We must spread the truth somehow. That evening, we had a meeting of the Committee of the Christian Mothers for Children's Clothing Club. My very Christian friend and relative, Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite, was our leader, but he could not come to the meeting because he had been attacked. I couldn't believe it. He had been to the bank, where he had spoken to another customer, and when he returned home, he received a message inviting him to come to a house. The writer said she wanted to give a large donation to the Committee of the Christian Mothers for Children's Clothing Club. Our Christian hero did not hesitate. When he arrived, he was attacked by some foreign men who searched his clothing and left him tied up on a chair. Soon he was rescued by the landlord of the house. Mr. Godfrey's belongings were scattered all over the room, but nothing was missing. What did it mean? Somebody had made a mistake and attacked the wrong person. But what a warning it is to us when even the great Christian heroes of our time can fall into such danger. Watch and pray. Strangely, Mr. Godfrey's experience was repeated with a Mr. Septimus Luker, the customer he had spoken to in the bank. The difference was that they took a piece of paper from him. It was a receipt for a deposit he had made at the bank, and the deposit was described only as an item of great value. The receipt was worthless to the thieves because the item could only be given to its owner personally. The police investigated both attacks, but made no arrests. On Tuesday, I went to lunch at Lady Verinder's house. She looked tired and worried, and when I saw her daughter, I was not surprised. Miss Rachel behaved in a very unladylike way. She ate and drank too much at lunch, and certainly laughed too much. Then she went to the library to read. "Goodbye, Clack," she said. I was not angry at her rudeness. I simply decided to pray for her that night. Lady Verinder told me the story of the diamond, and I felt sorry for her. I knew that if Rachel was involved in that, it was sure to go badly. However, I could not understand why Lady Verinder called a doctor instead of a clergyman. The doctor, obviously a man without faith, recommended parties and amusements. A clergyman would have recommended a better course of action, prayer. At that very moment, a servant announced that Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite had arrived and showed him into the room. Lady Verinder immediately told the servant to tell Miss Verinder that Mr. Ablewhite had arrived. We asked him how he was. He answered like a true Christian gentleman. He spoke to his aunt, but I knew that his smile was for me. He said that he felt lucky not to be murdered and happy that nothing was stolen. He was just about to ask me about the meeting of the Committee of the Christian Mothers for Children's Clothing Club when Miss Verinder entered the room. She said hello to Mr. Ablewhite in a most unladylike way and wanted to know all about what she called his adventure. "Godfrey has just said that he doesn't want to speak of it," said Lady Verinder. "Why not?" asked Rachel rudely. "Rachel, darling, true greatness and courage are always modest," I said gently. Rachel, of course, ignored me. She made Mr. Godfrey sit down and asked him lots of questions, which he kindly answered. Had the police caught the foreign men? No. Did he think they were the 3 Indian jugglers? He didn't know. What did he know about Mr. Luker? Nothing. What was the valuable item on the receipt? He didn't know. Was the public suggesting that it was the Moonstone? It was. Was the public suggesting that Mr. Godfrey had given the Moonstone to Mr. Luker? Mr. Godfrey did not want to admit it, but that was what some people were saying. Rachel became very upset at this answer. "Your good name is being destroyed. I cannot bear it." Lady Verinder was also upset. She pointed to a medicine bottle near her chair and asked me to give her some without Rachel seeing it. "My good name is not so easily destroyed," said Mr. Godfrey. "I will stop it," shouted Rachel. "Listen, Mother. Listen, Clack. I know who took the Moonstone, and I know that Mr. Godfrey is innocent. I will write it down. You are a better man than I thought, Godfrey." Mr. Godfrey gave her a piece of paper. She wrote something on it and signed it. "Show it to everyone," she said. I looked out the window and saw a horse and carriage and 3 women dressed in an unchristian way. "They have come to take me to the flower show," said Rachel. I tried to speak to her as she left, but she would not accept my pity. I asked Lady Verinder about her health. She told me that she would tell me about it soon when her lawyer, Mr. Bruff, comes. She had made a new will and needed me to be a witness to her signature. Chapter 11. Lady Verinder Shares a Secret. When Lady Verinder told me that she had made a new will, I immediately guessed that she was very ill and would die soon. Of course, her spiritual illness worried me even more, but I was ready to do my duty. "The doctors have said that I will not live long," she told me. "I don't want Rachel to know, because the lost diamond is more than enough for her to worry about at her age." Lady Verinder could not imagine how happy I was to hear these words. Here was an opportunity to help a dying person prepare herself for the great change. I had friends who would come and give her spiritual advice. I could ask 14 clergymen to pray for her. I offered her all this, but she looked puzzled and frightened and said she did not feel strong enough to see strangers. Then I offered her some books and leaflets. I had so many that could help her. I could mark all the parts in them that would help her most. "You will read them, won't you, dear aunt?" I asked. "I will do what I can to please you," she replied, looking surprised. I rushed home to get some books. I was so proud to have this opportunity to save my aunt that I gave the cab driver a leaflet. He swore at me, so I threw another into his cab as I left. When I returned to Lady Verinder's house with my bag of books, she was with the doctor, and Mr. Bruff, the lawyer, was waiting for her in the library. I had met Mr. Bruff before. He was an unspiritual man whose only interest was money. "You are a perfect witness for the will," he said. "You are over 21, and you are not mentioned in the will." Not mentioned in the will. No money from my rich aunt. How happy I was. Now nobody would think I was trying to help her just to get some money in her will. "How is your friend Godfrey Ablewhite?" asked Mr. Bruff. "They are telling some very strange stories about him in the town." "I know that the stories they tell about him are not true." "Of course, but not everybody believes him. The Indians attacked him because they knew that he had stolen the diamond." I reminded him that Sergeant Cuff suspected Miss Verinder and not Mr. Ablewhite. "Sergeant Cuff is wrong," he said. "Miss Verinder is the most truthful person I know. I would believe her rather than anybody else." I told him that Rachel had declared Mr. Godfrey innocent just a few hours ago, using the strongest language I had ever heard a young lady use. He jumped to his feet and stared at me. I told him the story of Mr. Godfrey's visit. "What do you think of my friend Mr. Ablewhite now?" I asked. "If Miss Verinder declares him to be innocent, I believe he is innocent," he answered. I was very pleased and allowed myself to smile. Mr. Bruff walked up and down the room, muttering to himself. "I don't understand," I heard him say. "Who could have taken it? I can't even guess. Perhaps Mr. Franklin Blake, who was also in the house, took it," I suggested. "Mr. Blake had no reason to take the diamond," answered Mr. Bruff. "I manage his business and know that his creditors are not worried about his debts because his father is a rich man. Miss Verinder had told her mother that she loved him and planned to marry him. Why would he steal from the girl he loved and who would probably marry him and then take the lead in trying to recover it?" I pointed out that the human heart was very sinful. "That may be so," he replied, "but that will not solve the crime. Miss Verinder is innocent, and so is Mr. Ablewhite because she has said so. Mr. Franklin Blake is also innocent, for he had no motive. Yet somebody has brought the diamond to Mr. Luker." Before I could repeat that Sergeant Cuff did not think so highly of Miss Verinder and suspected her of taking the diamond, a servant came to tell us that Lady Verinder was ready to see us, and I followed Mr. Bruff out of the library. The will was signed, and Mr. Bruff left. I immediately gave Lady Verinder an excellent book about Satan trying to get into our lives. She gave it back to me, saying she was not well enough to read anything, and that the doctor had told her to rest. "You might feel better soon. Can I leave it here for you?" I put the book next to her on the sofa and left her to rest. As I left, I put another book among the flowers on the windowsill. I put 2 more books on the library table, one near the canary cage in the breakfast room, 2 in the music room, and another in the back drawing room. My bag was empty. I was happy as I walked home, thinking of all the good that I had done. The next day, Lady Verinder's servant arrived with a large parcel. Before I opened it, I asked him if Lady Verinder was receiving visitors that day. He told me that she had gone for a drive with Miss Rachel and Mr. Ablewhite, and that they were all going to a concert the next day. I was worried about Mr. Ablewhite because he was neglecting his usual good works for the ladies' charities. Even the greatest Christian heroes are only weak humans. I opened the parcel and was surprised to find all my books in it. What could I do? I wrote letters and asked my friends to write some too. The next day I went back to Lady Verinder's house. She was too ill to see me, but I told the servant I would wait in the library until she felt better. I had some letters with me, and I went through the house, putting them in places where she was sure to find them. I was in the back drawing room when another visitor arrived at the house. I slipped into the small curtained-off room just before the visitor came into the drawing room. I heard him walking up and down and talking to himself. I peeped through the curtain and heard him say, "I will do it today." It was Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite. Chapter 12. Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite Proposes Marriage. I wondered what he was going to do. Then I heard the unlovely voice of Rachel Verinder. "Why are you here, Godfrey? You should be in the library." He laughed softly. "Miss Clack is in the library." "Clack in the library? You are right, Godfrey. We had better stay here." After hearing that, I couldn't come out. I sat down and waited to see what would happen. This is what happened. Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite told Miss Verinder that he loved her and then asked her to marry him. I could not believe my ears. How could our true Christian hero sink so low? Then Rachel told him that she loved another man, but had found him unworthy to be her husband. However, she could not stop loving him, though she would never see him again. She burst into tears. I saw Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite fall to his knees and put his arms around her. It was a dreadful sight. Then he repeated his proposal. "You may not love me, dearest Rachel, but I love you, and we might be happy together. I am not the worst person to be your husband." He continued to talk to her like this until she agreed. She began to cry again, and no good Christian woman can write about what he did next. It was bad enough to see it. Then she told him not to tell anybody about it yet. She wanted to wait until her mother was better. "Miss Rachel, come downstairs quickly. Your mother has fainted." It was one of the servants rushing into the drawing room. A moment later I was alone. I went back to the library. The doctor came to the house and examined Lady Verinder. "She is dead," he told us. No leaflets could help her now. What a warning for all of us. Prepare yourself for the great change while you have time. It was a month before I saw Miss Verinder again. I did not go to the funeral, which was held in Frizinghall, because I was too shocked to travel. Mr. Godfrey's father became Miss Verinder's guardian. The secret of the engagement was now known to the whole family. Miss Verinder rented a house in Brighton, planning to stay there with Mr. Godfrey's mother, my Aunt Ablewhite. My Aunt Ablewhite is a large, silent woman who never does anything for herself. She doesn't even think for herself. She sent for me and asked me to find servants for her. I saw Rachel. She looked small and thin in her black clothes. I was surprised when she apologized to me for being unfriendly. "Let's try to be friends," she said. I agreed. I had failed to help her mother. Perhaps I could help her. I went to Brighton and soon hired some good Christian servants for them. Then I borrowed some Christian books from a friend and put them in the house for Rachel to read. I visited some other good Christian friends in Brighton, and they all agreed to come and visit Rachel when she arrived. I sent her a message to say that everything was ready. The travelers arrived on Saturday evening. I was surprised to see Mr. Bruff with them. He told me he intended to stay. Mr. Godfrey had been delayed in London. On Sunday, Mr. Bruff went for a walk with Rachel. When they returned, I could see that he had said something to her that made her very quiet and thoughtful. As soon as he had gone, Rachel locked herself in her room and stayed there for the remainder of the day. The next morning I got into her room by following the maid who brought breakfast in. I asked her if she was well. I asked her if Mr. Bruff had brought bad news. I asked if it was about Mr. Ablewhite. "I will never marry Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite." "What do you mean?" I exclaimed. "He is coming today. You will see," Rachel replied. I saw another opportunity to help. If the engagement was broken off, she would need a friend. I would be there, with my leaflets and books, to be that friend. I went out for a long walk, and when I returned, I found Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite sitting in the dining room. "I have been waiting for you," he said in a friendly voice. Had he forgotten that I was a member of the Committee of the Christian Mothers for Children's Clothing Club, and that he had not attended a meeting for a long time? "Miss Verinder has broken off our engagement," he said. "She is beautiful and rich, but she told me that she loves another man. She only agreed to marry me to try and forget him. The marriage would not have worked. I am relieved it is over." I was very pleased. Our Christian hero had fallen, but now he was rising again. I almost fainted with joy. Mr. Godfrey hurried away to London, saying that he had to speak to his father there, and I went to lunch with Rachel and Aunt Ablewhite. After lunch I offered to read some parts from one of my books to her, but Rachel was more interested in the piano. Mr. Godfrey's father arrived the next day, and immediately after him came Mr. Bruff. "I thought I might be useful," explained Mr. Bruff. Mr. Ablewhite asked Rachel about the broken engagement. "I suggested it, and he agreed," she said. Mr. Ablewhite was angry. "What complaint do you have about him?" "You do not need to answer that question," said Mr. Bruff. "It is better for both of us if we do not keep the rash promises we made," replied Rachel. "That is the only answer I will give you." Mr. Ablewhite stood up so suddenly that his chair fell to the ground. "Your family is too rich and too proud," he shouted. "You think Godfrey is not good enough for you." I stood up too and called out to him. I held up a book and suggested he read it. I cannot write what he said, but it caused me to take a leaflet about bad language out of my bag and offer it to him. He took it, tore it in two, and threw it on the floor. Then he turned to his wife and pointed at me. "Who asked this idiot into the house?" he shouted. "She is my guest," said Rachel. "Very well," said Mr. Ablewhite, turning to Mr. Bruff. "If my son is not good enough to be her husband, I am not willing to be her guardian. Find somebody else." He walked out. I immediately offered to be Rachel's guardian. She looked very surprised and a little afraid. There is always opposition to the true Christian way. Mr. Bruff suggested that she should stay in his house for a while, and she quickly agreed. "Rachel, can't you see that I am trying to save you? Death took your mother before I could save her, but I can still save you. It is a terrible thing to die unprepared." She screamed. She ran to the door, closely followed by Mr. Bruff. She shouted at the servants to send her things to Mr. Bruff's house, and she was gone. I only tried to do what was right, but from that day on, I have never seen Rachel Verinder again. I pray for her every day, and I have left her my most precious books in my will. Chapter 13. Mr. Matthew Bruff tells his story. Mr. Franklin Blake has asked me to write the next part of the story because I know the reasons for the broken engagement. I was also personally involved in the next part of the story of the Moonstone. To understand the broken engagement, we need to go back to the time of Lady Verinder's late husband, Sir John Verinder. He owned a lot of land and had a lot of money. He had no sons, and usually this would mean putting the property in a trust until a male could inherit it. However, Sir John left everything to his wife. Lady Verinder's will put everything into a trust, making sure that it would provide a good income for Rachel without Rachel actually owning anything. If she married and had a son, that son would inherit the actual property. Neither she nor her husband would be able to borrow money or sell any of the property. They would only have the houses in Yorkshire and London to live in, as well as the income. Everything else would be held in a trust. A few days after Lady Verinder's death, I discovered that another solicitor had examined her will. I soon found out that he had examined the will at the request of Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite. I was worried. I didn't trust Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite, and I was unhappy about his engagement to Rachel Verinder. Why did he want to know what was in the will? Perhaps he needed a large sum of money. If that was true, He would be disappointed to discover that he would not own the property, but only receive an income. I decided to tell Rachel as soon as possible and went to Brighton to see her. We went for a walk, and I told her what I knew and what I suspected. She did not answer immediately, but walked on in silence for some time. Then at last she told me that she would break her engagement. I returned to London the next day, and in the evening Mr. Godfrey's father visited me. He told me that the engagement was broken and that Godfrey had accepted it. I was not surprised. It proved that my guess was correct. He needed a large sum of money and found that he would not get it from the will. Old Mr. Ablewhite asked me if I knew why Miss Verinder had broken the engagement, but I could not tell him what I knew. He was very angry and told me that he was going to Brighton the next day to see his wife and niece. I decided to go back to Brighton too, in case my help was needed. You have read about Mr. Ablewhite's behavior in Brighton in Miss Clack's part of the story. Miss Rachel came to stay at our house and stayed for a long time. We were pleased to have her in our house, and she seemed pleased to be with us. When a new guardian was appointed, we parted like friends. A week after her departure, an Indian gentleman came to visit me in my office. He put a little box of jewels on my desk and asked if I would lend him some money with the jewels as security. He said that Mr. Luker had recommended me to him. I asked him why Mr. Luker did not lend him the money. Mr. Luker told me that he had no money to lend. I told him that I did not lend money to strangers and that I did not accept securities such as his box of jewels. He did not argue, but put the box back into his pocket. If you had been able to lend me the money, he asked, when would it be usual for me to pay it back? In a year, I replied. That is the usual time in this country. He thanked me and left. Later that day, I received a letter from Mr. Luker himself asking for an appointment. I would not usually see a person like him, but I suspected that the visit of the Indian gentleman and Mr. Luker's request were connected with the Moonstone, so I agreed. He told me that he had also received a visit from the Indian gentleman with the box of jewels. He apologized for sending the man to me. I was frightened, he said, and didn't know what I was doing. Then he told me that the Indian gentleman had asked him exactly the same question about repayment of a loan. I went to a dinner party that night, and there I met Mr. Murthwaite. I told him about the visits of the Indian gentleman to Mr. Luker and myself. He explained that the three Indians had followed the Moonstone to England with Colonel Herncastle and waited for an opportunity to take it back. Their first opportunity came when the colonel died, and they discovered that the diamond had been left to Rachel Verinder. They tried to steal it from Mr. Franklin Blake as he took it to her, but luckily he avoided them by arriving early. They saw Miss Verinder wear it on her birthday and wanted to steal it from the house in Yorkshire, but failed. He advised Mr. Franklin Blake to cut the diamond up, but it disappeared before he could suggest it to Miss Verinder. While the Indians were locked up in Frizinghall, they received a letter, which the police opened. They could not read it because it was in Hindu, so they asked Mr. Murthwaite to translate it for them. It told the Indians to go to London, because the Moonstone had been seen there. How did it get there? Asked Murthwaite. Personally, I suspect Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite, he added. I remembered that Miss Rachel had declared Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite innocent. I told Mr. Murthwaite that I did not suspect him at all. We will have to wait and see who brought the Moonstone to London, said Murthwaite. He reminded me that Mr. Ablewhite and Mr. Luker had both been attacked and searched by the Indians, but that Mr. Luker had already put the diamond in the bank. That was their second chance, and they were too late. When will their next chance come? When the money is repaid, I replied. When will that be? He asked. In a year, I answered. You should expect to hear something about the Indians in June next year, he said. I made a note of it in my diary. Chapter 14. Mr. Franklin Blake tells his story. I was traveling in the East when I received a letter from Mr. Bruff. My father had died, and I had inherited his great wealth. He advised me to return to London as soon as I could. I had left England to try and forget Miss Rachel Verinder and the awful story of the Moonstone, but as soon as I returned, I visited Mr. Bruff and asked him about her. He told me everything that had happened in my absence, but he would not tell me why Rachel and Godfrey had broken their engagement. Rachel was now living with her new guardian, a widowed sister of Sir John Verinder called Mrs. Merridew. I went there immediately, but Rachel refused to see me. I spoke to Mrs. Merridew, but she refused to help me. I wrote to Rachel, but she sent the letter back unopened. I asked Mr. Bruff if he could explain her behavior, but he couldn't. He told me that she had never mentioned my name during my absence. There was only one thing to do. I decided to go to Yorkshire and find out who took the Moonstone. If I succeeded, perhaps Rachel would allow me to see her. Mr. Bruff thought it was useless to try, but I was determined and left on the next train. When I arrived at the house, I found old Betteridge smoking his pipe and reading Robinson Crusoe in a sunny corner of the garden. "Betteridge," I said, "has Robinson Crusoe told you to expect Mr. Franklin Blake tonight?" "Well," he replied, "that is exactly what it told me." He stood up and pointed to the book. I just read on page 156, "I stood as if I had seen a ghost." If that doesn't mean expect to see Mr. Franklin Blake, I don't know what does. He wanted to prepare a room for me, but I told him that I could not stay in the house. It was Rachel's house, and I felt unwelcome. Betteridge was disappointed, and I had to tell him how Rachel had refused to see me in London. He couldn't understand it. He advised me to speak to Rachel firmly, but he could not persuade me. I told him that I would walk to Frizinghall and stay at the hotel there. "Hutherstone's farm is much closer," said Betteridge. "I know that Hutherstone has a room to let. Why don't you stay there?" I agreed, and we walked to the farm together. "I hope you will excuse me for asking," said Betteridge, "but I am dying to know why you have come back." "I have come to find out who took the Moonstone," I replied. "Leave the Moonstone alone," he replied. "It has brought us nothing but trouble. Besides, even the greatest detective in England, Sergeant Cuff, could not solve the mystery." "I want him to help me," I answered. "He won't help you because he retired. He is growing roses on a farm." "Then I will have to do it without him. I am sure that you are willing to help me if I tell you that it is the only way that Miss Rachel and I can ever be together again. I do not care about the diamond. I only care for Miss Rachel." "I think I can help you," he said. "Do you remember Rosanna Spearman?" "How could I forget her?" "She gave a sealed letter to Lucy Yolland at Cobb's Hole. It was addressed to you. She would not give it anybody else, so we could not send it to you." I was very surprised. "Let's go and get it now," I said. "It's too late tonight. I will go with you early tomorrow morning." I didn't sleep well that night, and I went to see Betteridge very early in the morning. He was already waiting for me. He had not slept well either. We walked as quickly as we could to Cobb's Hole and found Mrs. Yolland working in the kitchen of her cottage. Before we could sit down, a girl approached me. She stared at me and asked Betteridge to repeat my name. "This is Mr. Franklin Blake," said Betteridge. The girl suddenly left the room. I could hear her limping up the stairs, and a moment later limping back down them. She entered the room with a letter. She did not speak to me, but signed that I should come outside with her. She led me behind some boats on the beach. "Stand there," she ordered. "I want to look at you." She looked at me. I could see that she hated me. "I can see nothing in you," she said. "Why would my precious Rosanna die for you? Take the letter. I never want to see you again." She put the letter into my hands and limped away. I opened the letter. It said, "If you want to understand my behavior toward you when you were in the house, do as this letter says." Then it described a place near the sands. I was to go there at the turn of the tide and pull on a chain that was under a certain rock. I showed the letter to Betteridge. "The tide would turn in about 1 hour," he said, and we hurried off toward the sands. We were early and had to wait. It was a beautiful morning to sit on the beach and smoke a cigar. The tide turned, and I went to the place that Rosanna Spearman had described in her letter. Betteridge waited on the beach while I searched for the chain. When I found it, I pulled on it, and up came a tin box on the end of it. I opened the tin and found a white nightgown inside it. There was an envelope with a letter in it on top of the nightgown. I put that in my pocket, and then I looked at the nightgown. Near the bottom of it was a mark that looked like paint. I remembered what Sergeant Cuff had said. "Find the clothing with the paint mark on it, and you will find who took the diamond." I had the clothing with the paint mark in my hand. I took it to Betteridge. Then I looked at the name tag on the collar. It had my name on it. I had discovered myself as the thief of the diamond. Chapter 15. Rosanna Spearman's Letter. Was I the thief? Had I taken the Moonstone? I showed the nightgown to Betteridge. What could I do? I went back to the house with Betteridge, sat down in his room, and had a drink. Betteridge put the nightgown on the table and examined it. "This nightgown is a liar," he said. "Look at the paint. Look at the name tag. I don't remember taking the diamond, but the paint and the name tag are facts," I replied. "There has been foul play," said Betteridge. "Was there anything else in the tin?" I remembered the letter and took it out of my pocket. It was from Rosanna Spearman. "She was a thief," I said to Betteridge. "She took the diamond and put the paint on my nightgown." "It's true that she was a thief," said Betteridge, "but I don't think she did what you think. Read the letter. Perhaps it will tell us something." I read the letter. Rosanna Spearman began by saying that she loved me. I dropped the letter. "What does it mean, Betteridge?" He gave me no answer. He advised me to have another drink and continue reading the letter. It was a very long letter. In it, Rosanna Spearman explained that she had taken my nightgown with the paint on it and hidden it in the box because she loved me. She admitted that she had been a thief and that her parents had been very poor. She claimed that Lady Verinder and Betteridge had been so kind to her that she had changed her life. She claimed that she had fallen in love with me at first sight when I arrived at the sands. She tried to get my attention, but I never took any notice of her at all. She cried when she went to bed at night. She began to hate Rachel because she could see that I was in love with her. She used to take the roses that Rachel gave me and replace them with her own. Her life was easy, she said, when she was a thief. It was more difficult in Lady Verinder's house because she wanted to please everyone so that they would not think of her badly. She wanted to be like other people, but it was very difficult. She couldn't make friends with the other servants because she was always afraid of what they thought of her. On the morning after the diamond was lost, she went with the other women to the little living room when the police officer stopped them from going to their rooms. Then he pointed out the mark on the new paint. She looked at her dress to see if she had done it, but Penelope told her that the paint had been dry for hours and that it couldn't be on her dress. She realized that the person who made the mark on the paint was probably the person who took the diamond during the night. She went to do her jobs. One of them was to clean my room, and that's when she found the paint mark on my nightgown. She was so surprised that she ran to her own room with it, where she could look at it properly. When she thought that I might be the thief, she was pleased because I would then be like her, and she might win me after all. It made her very excited, and she tried to speak to me about it, but without success. She tried to speak to me in the library, in the billiard room, and then in the garden, but each time she was interrupted. She went to Frizinghall to buy material and made a new nightgown so that the one marked with paint would not be missed. My letter reading was interrupted by a knock on the door. A very old man with sad eyes came into the room and gave Betteridge a list. "This is for next week," he said, and then he left. "Who was that?" I asked. Betteridge explained that it was the doctor's assistant. His name was Mr. Ezra Jennings. Dr. Candy was still ill and had lost his memory. He had hired an assistant. The list had the names of sick people that needed some extra help. Lady Verinder had always helped such people, and Rachel wanted this to continue. I returned to the letter. When Sergeant Cuff arrived, Rosanna Spearman had to hide the nightgown and decided to wear it under her own clothes. She hid it in the tin box at the end of the chain as we have seen. She said again how much she loved me and wanted to speak to me. She would try once more, and if I still took no notice of her, she would throw herself into the sands and sink out of life forever. It was a sad letter. I had misunderstood her. I never imagined that a servant girl would fall in love with me. I tried to understand how the paint could have got on my nightgown. Was I drunk on the night that the diamond was lost? I asked Betteridge. You had not been sleeping well, and we persuaded you to have a little cognac, but I put so much water in it that even a child would not have got drunk. No, you were not drunk. Have you ever seen me sleepwalking? I asked next. Never, replied Betteridge. Then how did I take the diamond without knowing it? You didn't. If you had, it does not explain what happened to the diamond afterward. It went to London and was given to Mr. Luker. How did you do that without knowing it? He was right. I didn't know what to think. Betteridge suggested I should go back to London and talk to Mr. Brough. I took the first train back to London. I went straight to Mr. Brough and showed him the nightgown and the letter. That explains Miss Rachel's behavior, he said when he had examined them. She believes you stole the diamond. Mr. Brough continued. Rosanna Spearman showed her the nightgown and made her think that you took the diamond. In fact, she took it herself. Nobody can prove that you were wearing the nightgown when it was marked by the paint on the door." "I must speak to her," I said. "It is the only way." Chapter 16. Miss Rachel Verinder Speaks. When I said that I had to speak to Rachel, I had no idea of how to do it. She had always refused to see me or even to answer my letters. However, Mr. Bruff suggested that he would invite her to his house and that I should come and meet her there. It was like a trap, but there was no other way, so I agreed. He gave me the key to the back gate of his garden and told me to come in at 3 o'clock on the day after the next. I received a letter from Betteridge saying that Dr. Candy had come to see me and was sorry that I had already left for London. He said that Dr. Candy had something to tell me. He had made him promise to tell him the next time I came to Yorkshire. I put the letter in my pocket and went for a walk. All I could think about was Rachel. What would she do when she saw me? The time passed slowly, but at last 3 o'clock arrived. I went to Mr. Bruff's back gate and let myself in. I was very nervous. As I approached the house, I could hear Rachel playing a sad tune on the piano. I opened the door and went in. Rachel stood up and stared at me. "Rachel," I said gently. She began to walk slowly toward me. I forgot all about the diamond. I forgot everything. I could see only the woman I loved. I took her in my arms and covered her face with kisses. For a moment it seemed that she had forgotten too, but then she cried out and pushed me away. Her eyes were angry. "You coward," she cried. "After everything you have done, you have now tricked me into letting you kiss me." "What have I done?" "You ask me that? I have kept your secret and suffered the consequences, but you still want me to tell you what you have done? I used to love you." She could not speak. She sat down and put her face in her hands. I did not trust myself to speak. I waited. When she didn't speak, I said, "Please listen to what I have to say. It is important." She did not answer. I told her about Rosanna Spearman's letter, the box at the end of the chain, and my nightgown in it. She listened to me without looking at me or saying anything to me. When I came to the end of the story, I asked her whether Rosanna Spearman had shown her the nightgown. She jumped up and walked toward me, staring into my face. "Are you mad?" she asked. I asked her again, "Did Rosanna Spearman show you the nightgown?" "What do you want? Your father died and you are rich. Have you come to give me money for the diamond? Are you finally ashamed of what you did? Why are you pretending to be innocent? Why are you telling me lies?" "You are wrong, Rachel. You think I took the diamond, and I want to know the reason why." "I don't think you took the diamond, you villain." "I know you took it. I saw you take it with my own eyes." I was struck dumb. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "I didn't tell anybody what I saw. I hoped that you would bring it back. You didn't. You pretended to help the police. It made me sick." I couldn't understand it and told her so. I begged her to tell me what happened on the night that the diamond was lost. At last she agreed. She told me that she had not been able to sleep that night and had got out of bed at about 1 o'clock in the morning. Then she saw a light in the small living room and heard footsteps. She looked through the doorway and saw me. I was wearing my nightgown and carrying a candle. I looked around the room before going to the Indian cabinet and taking the diamond. I stood there for a while before leaving the room. She did not go back to bed. She could not sleep, so she knew that it was not a dream. "I wish you had told me this story earlier," I said. She was furious. "Is there another man like this in the world? I protected him when he stole the diamond, and now he blames me for not telling him. I loved him, and now he blames me for not telling him that he was a thief. I would have given you whatever money you needed, but you stole the diamond instead of asking me to help you. You are a coward and a thief. I gave you opportunities to tell the truth, but you pretended to help the police. And after all this, you come here and tell me that I have done the wrong thing?" I opened the door to leave, but she took hold of my arm. "Why did you come here?" she demanded. "Are you afraid that I will tell people what I saw? I cannot. I still love you." She burst into tears. "I do not understand myself." I pulled myself away. "I will prove to you that you are wrong, or I will never see you again." I looked back as I opened the garden gate. She stood crying in the doorway. I could not say goodbye and left the garden. I didn't know what to do. Mr. Bruff suggested watching the bank where the Moonstone was because it was almost a year since it had been stolen. I agreed, but didn't think it would help. I decided to go back to Yorkshire. Perhaps the people at the birthday party could tell me something. I went to Frizinghall, and remembering Betteridge's letter about Dr. Candy, I went to see him. He was quite ill, and although he could remember that he wanted to tell me something, he could not recall what it was. Mr. Ezra Jennings, his assistant, thought he could help me. He asked if I had argued with Dr. Candy on the night of the birthday dinner. I remembered that I had not been sleeping well. He had advised taking some medicine, but I had disagreed with him. Dr. Candy often talks in his sleep, said Mr. Jennings. One night I heard him say that he had put opium in your drink that night because he was angry with you and wanted to prove that you did need medicine. I told Mr. Jennings that Rachel had seen me take the diamond that night. Could the opium make me do that? I asked. He thought that it could, and suggested that we should try to copy the situation exactly to see if the same things would happen again. I didn't know if this would work, but I was willing to try it. If it works, we may even find out where you put the diamond after you had taken it, he said. He was surprised when I told him that the diamond was in London, where Mr. Luker had put it in a bank. I told him about the Indians and their attacks on Mr. Luker and Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite. Have you seen the diamond in London? He asked. The Indians may be wrong. The item of great value may not be the Moonstone at all. Perhaps he was right. I wrote to Mr. Bruff to give him this opinion. Ezra Jennings offered to write to Rachel and tell her what he thought about the opium and to ask her permission to try his experiment in the house. Chapter 17. Mr. Ezra Jennings performs an experiment. Notes from the diary of Mr. Ezra Jennings. I received a reply from Rachel Verinder. She said that my letter had already convinced her that Mr. Franklin Blake was innocent. She gave permission to use the house for my experiment and offered to help if she could. I replied, asking her to time her arrival for the evening of the experiment so that Mr. Blake wouldn't know that she was there. Mr. Franklin told me that Mr. Bruff had written to him saying that he still believed the Moonstone was in London. He did not approve of our experiment. Neither did Mr. Betteridge, although he said that as a servant he would do whatever he was ordered to do. This is exactly what he did. Together we made the house as similar as we could to the evening of the night that the Moonstone was lost. Mr. Blake told me that he wrote to Sergeant Cuff and Mr. Bruff, inviting them to come to the experiment. I thought this was an excellent idea. Betteridge, meanwhile, told me that the experiment would end badly. He had read about it on page 178 of Robinson Crusoe. I told him that I did not believe in Robinson Crusoe, and from that moment he never spoke to me again, although he continued to do all the work that was required. The day of the experiment arrived. We went to the house at 5 o'clock and had our dinner at 7, exactly as on the night of the birthday dinner. Then I checked that everything was ready, including the opium, and made sure that Mr. Franklin Blake was in his room. The guests arrived at about 9 o'clock. As soon as Miss Verinder saw me, she began to ask questions about Mr. Blake, and then said how grateful she was for my letter. She went to her room, and I sat with Mr. Blake until it was time to give him the opium. Mr. Bruff was in the next room. At 11 o'clock, I went to the small living room and prepared the opium in some water, watched by Miss Verinder, Mr. Bruff, and Betteridge. Miss Verinder returned to her room, and I took the opium to Mr. Blake. While Mr. Bruff and Betteridge watched, I gave it to him to drink. He lay on his bed and was soon asleep. We sat and watched him. At about 12:30, he suddenly sat up. I should have left it in the bank. It is not safe here, he said. He lay down again. 5 minutes later, he stood up. How can I sleep when the diamond is not locked up, he said. He walked out of his room and into the small living room. We had put a false diamond in the Indian cabinet and he took it. What would he do with it? Suddenly, he began to look tired. He sat down, dropped the diamond, and fell asleep. The experiment had succeeded, but had not shown us what he did with the diamond once he had taken it. The next morning, everybody went back to London, happy but still puzzled. Mr. Franklin Blake's story. We were disappointed to leave Ezra Jennings in Frizinghall. However, we had to go to London as soon as possible, because Mr. Bruff had some people watch the bank where the Moonstone had been kept for a year. Perhaps somebody would come to claim it. At the station in London, a small boy employed by Mr. Bruff told him that Mr. Luker had gone to the bank. We rushed there just in time to see Mr. Luker come out of an office. The bank was very crowded, and we watched him carefully to see if he gave the diamond to anybody. He spoke to several people, and Mr. Bruff's assistants, who had been watching, followed them out. We searched the crowd for any Indians, but did not see any. Mr. Bruff's small boy had also disappeared. There was nothing more to do, so I went home to bed. The next morning, I was surprised by a visit from Sergeant Cuff, offering to help. I told him about the experiment with the opium. "How did the diamond get to Mr. Luker?" he asked. "Nobody knows," I replied. He wrote a name on a piece of paper and put it in an envelope. "Open this when you find out the truth," he said. Mr. Bruff's boy arrived and told us that he had seen Mr. Luker give the diamond to a tall man. He had followed the man to the wharf. The man had bought a ticket on a ship that was going to Holland. The boy also noticed that 3 Indians were following the tall man. The man took a room in a nearby hotel and went to bed. We went straight to the hotel where the boy had seen the tall man. We were too late. The hotel was crowded with police, and we soon learned that the tall man had been murdered in his bed. On a table in the corner of the room stood a small empty wooden box, and next to it lay a receipt from the bank for an item of great value. Sergeant Cuff looked carefully at the dead man. Suddenly he pulled the tall man's hair. It was a wig. Next he pulled off his beard. It was false. The dead man in the bed was my cousin, Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite. I looked at the paper in the envelope that Sergeant Cuff had given me earlier in the day. It also said Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite. Now we knew who had brought the diamond to London. Sergeant Cuff explained that he suspected Godfrey when he realized that Godfrey owed one of his father's customers over £20,000 and had no way to repay it. Later, Sergeant Cuff discovered that Godfrey had told Mr. Luker how he got the diamond. He had seen me with the diamond when I came out of the little living room with it. He also saw that Rachel had seen me. I actually gave him the diamond and asked him to put it in his father's bank. Instead, he took it to Mr. Luker. When he got it back, he was on his way to Holland, probably to cut the diamond up and make a lot of money by selling it. Unfortunately for him, the Indians found him and took it from him. No doubt, they and the Moonstone are safely back in India.
Playlet. The Moonstone. Other guests for the dinner party. Rachel is standing in a room talking to Godfrey's 2 sisters. Godfrey is talking to Lady Verinder in another part of the room.
"I'm so pleased that we could come to your party, Rachel. I'm sure it will be a lot of fun."
"Yes, and you look so pretty in your new dress. Did you buy it in Frysing Hall?"
"No, Mother got it in—"
Franklin Blake enters the room, carrying a box with the diamond in it. He is also carrying a sheet of paper.
"Oh, look, here's Franklin. Hello, Cuz Franklin." "Oh, he looks well, doesn't he?"
"Did you hear her call him Cuz? What a funny name."
Hello, Cuz Rachel. I have a little something for you.
"Oh, what is it?"
"Oh, do let us see."
I should warn you that this is a gift from your Uncle Herncastle, left to you in his will. When Lady Verinder hears this name, she walks to the group, and Godfrey follows her.
"What's this about Uncle Herncastle? Nothing good ever came from him."
Perhaps he is sorry for being so unfriendly when he was alive. He gives the box to Rachel. She opens it and stares open-mouthed at the diamond inside it.
"Oh, Mother, look at this. It's beautiful." "Oh, let me see."
"Oh, it's the biggest diamond I ever saw."
Aunt Verinder, my father asked me to give you your brother's will. Your brother wanted you to read it." Lady Verinder looks briefly at the diamond, and then takes the will. She goes to a corner of the room to read it.
"Look, Godfrey, isn't it just the most beautiful diamond in the world?"
Well, yes, it is rather beautiful. It must be worth a lot of money.
Oh, Godfrey, how could you? It doesn't matter what it is worth. It's beautiful. You are so lucky, Rachel.
Gabriel Betteridge enters the room.
Dinner is served, ladies and gentlemen.
They all go out of the room. Rachel is carrying the diamond, and the two sisters are still admiring it as they go out through the door. The last person to leave is Lady Verinder. She speaks to Betteridge as she goes out.
I don't trust my brother, Gabriel. Please keep an eye on Rachel and make sure no harm comes to her by this diamond.
Yes, of course, my lady.
While the room is empty, two servants bring in a long table, or several shorter ones to make one long one, and at least 8 chairs, preferably more. Then all the people come back in, with the addition of Dr. Candy and Mr. Mirthwaite, and as many other people as can sit on the chairs. They sit down and have dinner. Mr. Mirthwaite sits near Rachel. Dr. Candy sits next to her, but near Franklin Blake. Rachel is wearing the diamond on her dress. Betteridge and Penelope serve dinner as they talk.
It's a lovely diamond, Miss Verinder. Did I hear that your uncle got it in India?
Yes, that's what Franklin said.
Can I give you some advice, Miss Verinder? If you ever travel to India, do not take the diamond with you.
Really? Why not?
Sometimes, valuable jewels like this are important for religious reasons, and it is possible that somebody may harm you and try to steal it from you.
Oh, how exciting.
Yes, it's not only beautiful and valuable, but it is also dangerous. How wonderful!
It may be exciting here in Yorkshire, but it would be more than exciting in India. Please, don't forget what I said.
I'll be sure that whenever I go to India, I will leave the diamond here, Mr. Mirthwaite. You can count on it.
Mr. Franklin, you are looking very tired. Are you sleeping well?
No, I'm not. I gave up smoking a few days ago, and I find it hard to sleep now.
You should let me give you some medicine.
I'm sure I don't need medicine, Dr. Candy. My body can cure itself.
I think it would be much better to take some medicine.
Are you deaf, Dr. Candy? I said I don't need medicine.
But I think you do. And I think I don't.
Gentlemen, please, it's a birthday dinner. We don't need arguments at the table.
You're quite right, Lady Verinder. I do apologize. And so you should. Doctors these days seem to think they know everything.
Franklin!
Dr. Candy gets up and leaves the room. Yes, I know, Aunt. I'm sorry, but he really is very annoying. A drum is heard outside. Sister One goes to the window to look out.
Oh, it's some Indian jugglers. Let's watch.
Oh, I love Indian jugglers.
Everybody gets up from the table and goes to the windows. They look out at the Indian jugglers, saying, "Ooh," and "Ah." Mr. Mirthwaite goes out to the jugglers. Everybody at the windows looks disappointed. He comes back in.
I told them to go away because they are not real jugglers. I think they want the diamond and would kill to get it.
What should I do?
Send the diamond away to be cut up as soon as you can. Then they will lose interest in it.
Dr. Candy returns to the room. He speaks to Godfrey in a corner.
I think your cousin Franklin needs a little drink before he goes to bed. Will you make sure he gets it?
He gives Godfrey a little bottle.
If you put this in it, he will sleep better, but don't tell him.
All right.
Listen to that rain, just as it is time to go home.
Oh, we all have closed carriages.
We will be nice and dry. What about you, Dr. Candy?
My carriage is open, but we doctors have waterproof skin. The rain won't hurt me.
It's a shame to be going home in this weather.
Yes, but it can't be helped.
Goodbye, Lady Verinder. It's been an interesting evening. All the guests except Godfrey and Franklin leave. saying goodbye. Happy birthday, Rachel, and it was a lovely evening.
I think it's time for bed.
Rachel, where are you going to put the diamond tonight?
It's an Indian diamond, so I will put it in the Indian cabinet in the small living room.
But it doesn't have a lock on it.
Is this a hotel? There aren't thieves walking around, are there?
You can put it in my room if you like. I think it will be safer there.
I'm sure it will be just as safe in my Indian cabinet.
Very well, Rachel. Good night.
Good night, Mother.
Everybody leaves except Franklin.
Have a drink, Franklin. It will help you sleep.
He hands Franklin a glass of wine. He drinks the wine. They leave the room. The room stays empty for a while. Then Betteridge enters and opens curtains and starts to light a fire. Suddenly, Penelope bursts into the room.
Come quickly, Father. The diamond is missing.
They both leave the room very quickly.
Rather read than talk when there was no work to be done, so she didn't make friends with the other servants. She also liked going on lonely walks by herself, while the other servants often walked together. She was not beautiful and had a bad shoulder, but she was very polite and obedient, and I liked her. One of the places where she often walked was the sands. The house was close to the sea, and the sands were part of a small bay. It was only a quarter of a mile away, but it was not a popular walk. The bay was ugly, and the sands were dangerous. Anything thrown onto these sands would quickly sink and would never be seen again. This is where Rosanna liked to come and read. The only other place she sometimes visited was Cobb's Hole, where she had a friend. I'll tell you more about that later. I found her sitting near the sands, looking at the sea and crying. I am crying about the past, she said, when I asked her why she was sad. The past has been cleaned away, I replied. Yes, but it still leaves a mark, she said. She looked at the sands. Sometimes I think the sands will be my grave, she said. Come back to the house, I replied, but she would not listen. She continued to look at the sea and talk about the sands until I suddenly heard an unknown voice calling me. Rosanna turned around to see who it was, and I saw her face turn red. Who is it? I asked. Yes, who is it? She whispered. I turned around to see a young gentleman coming toward us. He ran up and sat beside me. I owe you 7 shillings, Betteridge, he said. Do you know who I am? It was Mr. Franklin Blake. He was 4 hours earlier than we had expected. I saw him look at Rosanna and noticed that her face was even redder than before. She suddenly turned and ran away without speaking to me. What a strange girl, said Mr. Franklin. I could not explain her behavior, and we soon forgot about her. However, if you read on, you will discover the truth, and perhaps you will feel as sorry for Rosanna Spearman as I did. Mr. Franklin explained that he was early because he noticed that he had been followed in London. When I told him about the 3 Indians who had come to the house, he became very serious. I think that it means this, he said, taking a small parcel from his pocket. This is my Uncle Herncastle's famous diamond. My uncle left the diamond to Rachel as a birthday present. My father has asked me to give it to her. This surprised me because I knew that Colonel Herncastle was a bad man. He was my lady's older brother, but he had such a bad name that she would never allow him to enter her house. Everybody knew that he had a valuable diamond, but he would not tell anybody how he got it or even let them see it. He never married and had no friends. About 2 years before the time of our story, he came to the house and asked to see Lady Verinder. It was Rachel's birthday and he wanted to see her. My lady did not want to see him, so I told him that both she and Rachel were too busy. He laughed at that and said that he would remember his niece's birthday. Then he left. A year and a half later, he died. When I told Mr. Franklin this, he was even more worried. I think that my wicked uncle may be trying to get revenge on his sister by giving this unlucky diamond to Rachel. This made me so worried that I longed to smoke my pipe and read a few pages of Robinson Crusoe. Many years ago, continued Mr. Franklin, My father wanted some family papers from my Uncle Herncastle. My uncle would not give them to him unless he agreed to help him with the diamond. He said that the diamond would be kept in a bank, and that my father was to receive a letter from him each year to prove that he was still alive. If the letter did not arrive, it would mean that he had been murdered. My father was then to send the diamond to Amsterdam immediately and have it cut up into separate diamonds. My father agreed, and never saw his brother again, although he received a letter from him every year. 8 months ago, he received a different letter, asking him to come and help him make his will because he was dying. In this will, my uncle left the diamond to Rachel, but only if her mother was still alive. The will also said that this was proof that he had forgiven her, but I don't trust him. He knew that the diamond was unlucky, and he also knew that the Indians wanted it back. That's why he gave it to Rachel. The will also said that Lady Verinder had to read the will so that she would know he had forgiven her. I began to understand why Mr. Franklin was worried. Chapter 3. Rosanna Spearman Falls in Love. Mr. Franklin told me that when he took the diamond out of the bank to bring it with him to Yorkshire and give it to Rachel, he was followed by an Indian man. He eventually got away from him and caught an earlier train. Then Penelope told me about 3 Indian jugglers talking about me and wondering if I had it with me. Could this be coincidence? It makes me so worried that I think I should throw it into the sands so that it can do no about starting something you can't finish. Robinson Crusoe is an amazing book. I am over 70 years old and I still have a good memory. I've read a few books, but none of them is like Robinson Crusoe. It always helps me to read it. I have worn out 6 copies by reading them. On her last birthday, my lady gave me a 7th. I sat down to read it immediately. I haven't said much about the diamond yet, have I? I'd better start again. The diamond came to my lady's house in Yorkshire when it was given to her daughter as a birthday present. I have known my lady since I became a servant in her father's house when I was 15. She was the youngest of the 3 Herncastle daughters, and she married Sir John Verinder. I have been with her ever since that time. I became the chief groundskeeper with my own house and my own housekeeper. I decided to marry my own housekeeper because that was cheaper than paying her to look after the house. Then I changed my mind, but my housekeeper refused to let me go. We were not happy, but we weren't miserable either. We always got in each other's way. If I was coming up the stairs, she was sure to be coming down, and if I was coming down, she was sure to be coming up. You see how it was. We had a daughter, Penelope, and 5 years later my wife died. Soon after that, Sir John Verinder died too, leaving my lady with a daughter, Miss Rachel. My lady looked after her daughter and looked after mine as well, and at last Penelope became Miss Rachel's personal maid. This made me very happy. Then my lady suggested that I become the house steward. I couldn't decide what to do because I enjoyed the position I had. I started to read Robinson Crusoe. Within 5 minutes I read, "Today we love what tomorrow we hate." I immediately decided to be the house steward, and all because of Robinson Crusoe. Penelope just looked at what I have written and pointed out that I have not said anything about the diamond yet. I've been telling my own story instead. I'd better start again. I'll start with the day that we expected Mr. Franklin Blake to visit the house. Penelope has a diary, so she can tell me the dates. It was Wednesday, the 24th of May, 1848, when my lady told me that Franklin Blake was returning from Europe the next day. He would stay long enough to celebrate Rachel's birthday in June. Rachel was my lady's 17-year-old daughter. I was very pleased to hear of Mr. Franklin Blake's visit because I really liked him. I had not seen him since he was a boy because his father had sent him to Europe for his education. He went to school in Germany and sometimes wrote to us. He borrowed 7 shillings from me before he left, and his letters were usually about borrowing more. When his mother died, he got some money from the will, but it was never enough. The more money he had, the more he wanted. Of course, I never got my 7 shillings back from him. Despite this, he was a friendly and generous man, and by now he was 25 years old. Thursday was a beautiful summer day, and my lady and Miss Rachel went out for lunch. Mr. Franklin Blake was not expected until dinner time. I made sure that his room was ready for him. Then I decided to sit in the sun with a glass of wine and Robinson Crusoe. As I came outside, I heard a soft drum. I went to the front of the house and found 3 Indian men in white clothes looking at the house. One of them asked me if he could show the lady of the house some magic tricks. I told them that the lady of the house was not home and asked them to leave. They left, and I returned to my chair in the sun. I was almost asleep when Penelope ran out of the house and told me that the 3 Indian gentlemen should be arrested. She had heard them talking about Mr. Franklin Blake and wondering whether he had it with him. I didn't think it was very important and wanted to go back to sleep, but Penelope insisted that we find out what it was. I told her that we would have to ask Mr. Franklin Blake when he arrived. Chapter 2. Mr. Franklin Blake arrives in Yorkshire. I had only just sat down again when Nancy, the kitchen maid, came past me looking annoyed. She told me that she had been told to fetch Rosanna, the second housemaid, who had gone to the sands. I told Nancy that I would go and fetch her. However, before I tell that part of the story, I will have to tell you about the sands and about Rosanna because they are both important to the story of the diamond. Rosanna was the only new servant in the house. My lady, visiting London about 4 months before this time, went to a reformatory where young girls went after they had been in jail. She met Rosanna Spearman there. Rosanna was a thief, but the staff told my lady that she deserved another chance. They were sure that she would not steal again if she was in a good house. My lady brought her to Yorkshire. The only people in the house who knew about Rosanna's past were my lady, Rachel, and me. Rosanna seemed thankful for the opportunity to start a new life, and she became a very good servant. However, she would Prologue. The Moonstone was a large yellow diamond that was famous in the history of India. It was first heard of in the 11th century when the holy city of Somnath, where it was kept, was captured by a Mohammedan general. The Hindu priests who guarded the diamond escaped and took it to Benares, another holy city in India. 3 priests were given the job of watching the diamond day and night. When the priests grew old, they were replaced by other priests. Hundreds of years passed. Then a Mughal emperor attacked the city and took the diamond. The 3 priests could not take it back by force, but they followed the diamond as it passed from one emperor to another. At last, the Sultan of Seringapatam put the diamond in the handle of a dagger and put it in his treasury. The 3 Hindu priests disguised themselves and continued to watch the diamond. Then, in 1799, the British army attacked Seringapatam. The soldiers heard stories about the yellow diamond, but the general of the army said the soldiers were not to take any treasure. However, a greedy officer called Herncastle killed the 3 Indian priests and took the diamond. The last of the priests to die told him that the diamond would bring him bad luck. Chapter 1. Gabriel Betteridge begins the story. My name is Gabriel Betteridge, and I am the house steward for Lady Verinder. Yesterday I was reading my favorite book, Robinson Crusoe, and on page 169 I read, I realized how stupid it was to start a job without knowing whether it was possible to finish it. This morning Mr. Franklin Blake, my lady's nephew, spoke to me. Betteridge, I think the strange story of how the Indian diamond was stolen from my aunt's house 2 years ago should be written down. I agreed with him, of course, but didn't realize that he wanted me to start the story. You can tell the story of how the diamond came to my aunt's house and how it was lost after just 12 hours, he said. I told him that I was not a writer, but he insisted, and I agreed to do it. That was 2 hours ago, and I have been trying to write, but I keep remembering what Robinson Crusoe said